You've heard all about Mr. Trump. You've heard all about the battle between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. You've heard about the upending. And what I want to do today is suggest deeper forces behind these phenomena. And the first thing to understand is that we have going on in the American election right now two separate insurgencies. It's part of why it's confusing, because it's not just one thing going on, one upheaval in the political world. It's two distinct upheavals, which have been building over quite a long time and which have different sources. Now, the first upheaval, obviously Mr. Trump is part of an upheaval, but he has a partner in that, most unlikely partner, Bernie Sanders, Senator Sanders, the socialist, really, senator from Vermont, who is running against Mrs. Clinton. And while their view of the world may be quite different in many respects, both of them are basically arguing the same things, saying the same things in large parts of what they're advocating. There are differences, but the issues that are common are what I'm going to focus on. They've been saying that the American economy is rigged, that the wealthy have an unfair advantage, that trade from overseas is hurting Americans, that they have different views on immigration, but those, Mr. Trump's views, work into that whole critique. They are speaking, while the people who support each of them are somewhat different, those people are united by the fact that their job prospects in particular are slipping, their incomes in many respects are slipping. Who are those people? On both sides, they're Americans although they do well across all income groups. They have a particular strength among, and Mr. Trump does, among Americans who are have high school diplomas or less in education, who have been working in fields which have been losing employment. This is particularly manufacturing. Both of Trump and Sanders talk a lot about manufacturing jobs going away, going overseas in Mr. Trump's case, and sort of magically disappearing in Mr. Sanders' case, Senator Sanders' case. And so you've got these two, this area where, despite figures that would make you think the American economy is doing pretty well, the advertised figures, indicate that the economy, at least for some parts of the population, is not doing well. My own view is the economy, the numbers that we focus on, unemployment in particular, elements of income, direction in income, are outmoded. The way we take those, we gather that data is outmoded. The economy has changed tremendously since that data was put together. Those data sets started to be put together. The data sets, there have been attempts to bring them up to the current structure of the economy and the like, and employment, but they haven't been fully successful. And so we are getting confusing and really false signals in many cases out of our national economic data. An example of this is the question of unemployment. At the moment, you'll read in the papers that unemployment is at a very low level. But we find that if we dig into that data, that participation in the labor force has been dropping for some time. We hear, well, that's partly because the population, the baby boom, which is that big group that was born right after the Second World War, basically between about 1945, as soldiers from the war over here came home, to probably about 1958, that period. a 10, maybe going into the early 60s, a 10, 15-year period. And there was a big bubble in births, and that group is now reaching retirement age. So we hear, well, that's why. But in fact, if you take the cohorts of that come throughout the population and look at the cohorts of prime employment, that group, those people are also seeing a decline in their labor force participation rates. And so we have, there's something going on, and yet, and this is something you ought to keep in mind, the structure of employment has changed. For many people, particularly college-age people, it's not unusual for them to have multiple jobs in the first few years out of school. It's not unusual to have multiple sources of employment now. These kinds of, Gallup, the polling company, has a great deal of, puts out a figure that is good jobs. And by good jobs, they mean basically full-time jobs. But many, many Americans now make excellent incomes from part-time jobs where they have a number. It's, this is part of what, an example of this would be, I had dinner the other day with a computer programmer. My son is starting a company. He's starting a company with very little capital. He's also got a full-time job. He's got several other, typical of this age group, maybe your age group. And he had a computer programmer working with him. That computer programmer goes around the world. He had just come back from a vacation, except the vacation was he got on his computer in the morning and he wrote code for a company in California, and then he went off and did something. So what I'm saying here is the national income data doesn't really reflect something like that. So it's very hard to know what's going on, but what we do know is that there are certain cohorts, certain groups that are slipping, that are having a hard time. We don't know, but Mr. Sanders' support is heavy in people about your age, 20s. If you're older than 20 for today's purpose, you're 20s. And that's a group that looks, at least on the national income data, as having a real rough time, not having trouble finding jobs coming out of university, and particularly coming out of high school. On the other side is Mr. Trump, who is said to work to have particularly strong support in the what is called the working class. In the United States, that's really a level of income and skill rather than your father did something and your grandfather did something and you're doing the same thing. In the United States, that's an income skill indicator, not a heritage indicator. It's not really a class in the European sense. But the working class, the income, education, basically high school, and probably not, if college, not much, middle income or somewhat sub-middle income, that group has been having a great deal of trouble. Recently there was a study that came out that was widely noted and is depressing, that found that life expectancy in all groups in the United States, minorities, Black, Hispanic, Asian, college age, everybody was having a rising life expectancy with the exception of one group. And that group was people who were males, not of minority background, 45 to 54 years old. And the causes were alcoholism, drug overdoses, and suicide. That suggests that there's something very alarming going on in that group. Think of that as that group as likely to be voting for Trump. All right, are you getting me? You're understanding where this upheaval is coming from. Is it coming from, is it right that these are, this is a result of the collapse of manufacturing? We talk about the rise of in the United States, that manufacturing is going away. And that there's populism. We've been through a populist moment before, and it was more or less an identical moment. This was the mid-19th century to about the end of the first quarter of the 20th century. It continued somewhat later, but that's when its political impact was most strongly felt, and it had an impact on the development of the New Deal in the 30s and 40s. That's Franklin Roosevelt's administration. And this was a period, beginning of this period, 90% of the American population was employed in agriculture, worked the farm, involved in the farm, and if they weren't working in the farm and involved in the farm, they were probably doing things related to serving the farm economy. My grandfather and great-grandfather were small merchants in a small town. Their customers were all farmers. Their business went up and down with the strength of agriculture. If agriculture was going through a difficult time, they were having problems. If agriculture was doing well, they were doing well. By the end of the period, by the 1960s, remember 90% at the end of the 1860s. Go now to the end of the 1960s. Agricultural employment in the United States was 2%. We'd gone from 90% to 2% in the course of a century, and with a great deal of it in the period I'm talking about. Did this mean that agricultural output went down in the United States? No, agricultural output went up. The United States now produces far more grain, far more agricultural products of all sorts than it did then. It also produces more on less land than it did then. Productivity increases. Was there foreign competition in that time? Yes, in agriculture. Think of wheat, a major product of the Midwest, of the Midwestern U.S. Wheat began in this period, at the beginning of this period, American farmers had very little in the as the wheat areas opened up, had very little foreign competition. They exported a lot. In the second half of the 19th century, Russia came online as a major wheat producer. Argentina came online as a major wheat producer. Australia came online as a major wheat producer. In other words, there was foreign competition. In this same period, there was a great deal of investment from overseas in the United States, particularly from the London financial markets. And that investment went into several sources. One of them was financing farmers, moved through Wall Street. The other place it went was the rise of industry. Put a different way, the diversification of the American economy through manufacturing away from agriculture. And so as farmers were squeezed, there became, by all this, the United States, I should say, did very well in this period overall. American farmers did as hard as they worked. They nevertheless were the world's low-cost producers. And so the economy boomed. The farm part of the economy boomed, but life became harder and harder. And many farmers were borrowing, and then they'd have they'd be squeezed in terms of the price they could get on their crop. And there developed a whole movement around advocating inflation. This was called the Free Silver Movement. The idea of it was the United States was on the gold standard. It had returned to the gold standard with a period adjustment after the Second World War, and the Civil War, excuse me, the American Civil War, and then you have these periods of other competitors coming online. The United States does okay because the farmers are the low-cost producers in the world, but then you hit a series of bad crops in the 1890s. And the result of this was a huge depression. The free silver movement promises under a man named William Jennings Bryan, who became the Democratic Party nominee in 1896. I know this is esoteric, 1896, but it is related to this election. In 1896, that with the promise of creating lots of new money through mining silver and turning it into coins. This was a real, the William Jennings Bryan candidacy was the first real populist candidacy, very similar to Trump and in some ways similar to Sanders in American history. It's happening under the same circumstances we're seeing now. Now, the fact is that Bryan lost by large margins in that campaign. And the vote against him was really a vote for continuing international, the tie of the United States to the global financial markets and to global markets generally. That also is probably a dynamic we'll see going into the fall, because as much as there are parts of the U.S. economy that are feeling stress from the movement of away from manufacturing and the other factors I've mentioned, there are also other parts of the U.S. economy that are benefiting. But what's happening with manufacturing now? As with agriculture in the earlier period, it's going up. It's becoming, the manufacturing of the output of the United States is increasing. But it's coming from different sources than it used to. The old industries and where it's coming from the same sources, those sources are vastly more productive than they once were. If you had gone to an American steel mill in 1950, a major American steel mill would have tens of thousands of people working in it. Today it may have 500, if that. Automation, robotics, information technology, all of these have transformed how, in the same way that the steel plow and the mechanized tractor and other inventions transformed farming, and continue to, these inventions, these developments, information technology, robotics, even nanotechnology, the biggest users of drones in the United States are farmers right now. Of course, you put the drone up over your field and you can get a view of your field. Major users of various forms of aerial mapping are farmers, so that they can micro-target where their fertilizer and where their various pesticides and seeds are to go. All of that's happening in the U.S. economy. What am I saying? When you have these big upheavals, some people benefit, maybe the entire economy benefits, but other people are distressed. And that group that's distressed is the group that both Sanders and Trump are appealing to right now. The second insurgency has been building for maybe 2 decades. Its first manifestation was under Ross Perot, and then later the Tea Party. And this one is more of It comes, well, I'll tell you a story about it. In 2005, this is a year, really 6 months after George Bush is reelected, I sat in a dinner in Washington. And in that dinner, it was maybe this row all the way over here, that number of people, the 2 rows here, okay? Not tremendous numbers of people, or maybe the first 3 rows. But they were mainly journalists, some political people, but mainly journalists. And our guest of the evening was Senator John McCain. He had to go, as he arrived as senators do, late. You never invite senators to a dinner party. In case you have not ever wondered, don't invite senators to a dinner party. They are always being called back to Capitol Hill for votes. And he was called back to Capitol Hill for a vote. While we waited for him to return, we went around the table and each made observations about the election that had just occurred and what would come next. And a woman stood up, a woman I regard as probably one of the 2 or 3 best pollsters in the United States. She's a conservative Republican pollster, but she is very astute. And she said, I am finding in my polling a split in the 2004, remember 6 months earlier, Bush vote. Actually, November, December, this is June, so 7 months earlier, 8 months earlier. I am finding a split in the Bush vote, and it is over spending, regarding spending. It's being driven by the fact that the president and the Republican Congress are not holding a lid on spending. Remember that in the later Bush, Bill Clinton period, we had surpluses in the United States. Remember that Ross Perot's criticism of President Bush, the first President Bush, was not so much that he had failed to hold the line on taxes, that he had allowed tax increases. It was that spending was too high and that deficits were too high and debt was too high. He was also critical, he had mixed elements of Trump. He was also critical of overseas trade. But in this case, she was talking about spending is going up, the Republicans are not holding the line, and the Republican vote is starting to split. Well, you could virtually see, if you were active in politics, that sense of outrage at the rising of spending and the failure to hold the line on federal national debt growing in Republican audiences for the next 2 years. That set the stage for the Democrats taking over Congress in 2006 and Barack Obama becoming president in 2008. That was a critical factor. As Mr. Obama started to run for president, there was deep division within the Republican vote. An example of this in the 2006 election, when the Democrats won, the Republicans in 2004 had an outstanding turnout election day operation. That was the mechanisms by which the party identifies people who are its voters or likely voters, and then encourages them to come to the polls. And if the party, this is a critical part of any American election. Remember, all American elections are, participation is voluntary. You are not required by law to show up. You are not required by law to participate in a political party. If you participate in a political party, you are not paid. It is almost entirely voluntary, with the exception of a few professionals who are either consultants or in party offices, but they don't have the same kind of control that they have in Britain or Europe. And so, this pollster said, we are finding that that vote is splitting. And so, so we go to 2006, and that vote, after the 2006 election, the morning after, the man who had run the turnout campaign for Bush in 2004, which was regarded as the best in history, gathered his staff together and said, well, again this year, we turned out our vote. It's just they voted for the other guy. And that's been the story of the Republican Party since then, struggling with that division. What I'm saying is the Trump part of the Trump insurgency is new. This other insurgency, although has been building for a while, this other insurgency we have seen coming over and over again in the Republican Party. The candidate who this year targeted that disaffected group and said, I'm going to pull them back in, is Ted Cruz. Everything that he has done over the last several years since entering the Senate has been designed to make himself the spokesperson for that disaffected group. Now, those are the two insurgencies. Each of them has its villains. Wall Street, if you're following the election, you've heard this. Wall Street insiders, people who are that sort of person. The one candidate who could be, well, there have been two candidates, one's no longer in this, who could be considered as the poster children of those insurgencies, of their villains. Jeb Bush is one. Insiders affiliated with the financial world. The other is Hillary Clinton. And this has a lot to do with why Hillary Clinton has had trouble in this campaign. She was supposed to, like Jeb Bush, take off. This was going to be Clinton versus Bush all over again. Bush is out, and Clinton is struggling. If you look at Clinton's national polling, you would find that it's flat, maybe dipping a bit right now. If you look at Sanders, it's going up at a 45-degree angle. Sanders has been moving up, and as I was preparing for these lectures, I was asking myself, where will those lines cross? Because she was getting close to Sanders. And I thought, well, maybe, not necessarily, by the time of the New York primary, which is next week, and which is going to be an important factor in this. Instead, it happened, the first poll that had Sanders ahead of Clinton was last week. It's moving very fast. So we have now this kind of dynamic in the American election. What does that mean for the future? I've been asked to give you my prediction. And coming from Washington, just keep in mind that my predictions are in Washington, very typical of Washington, on the one hand, on the other hand. And my response afterwards, if they turn out to be right, I will proudly stand up for them, and if they're wrong, I'll deny all knowledge of them. So let me say where we stand right now. We've had a series of wins for Mr. Sanders, and we've had pretty good showings and actually quite good showings also for Cruz and Kasich. And on the Republican side, there are some excellent attempts to do high mathematics, and I truly do mean high mathematics in this case. I'm pretty sure they're based on Monte Carlo simulations, and if you're, and that's a form of attempting to get at what various combinations of probabilities produce and what kind of outcomes they produce, and you do the calculations, random combinations of calculations large numbers of times, 10,000 or 20,000 or a million times. And you start to get spreads. The New York Times has put this together. The reason you need this is you've got 50 states. Every state has different rules. Those rules can play out in different ways. Many of them are multiple. Every congressional district in some states, is up for grabs. So it's highly complex, but they've done a pretty good job of it. And the basic conclusion of this, I've gone through this. I haven't done all those calculations, but they have it on their website, and you can play around. And what it basically leads to is, if Mr. Trump stays at 35%, which is where he has been on average in the voting so far, not in the polls, sometimes he's higher, but in the voting, he seems to come out, not quite always, but often, at about 35%. If he stays there, he's not going to get the nomination. On the first ballot, he will not go in with enough delegates to win the nomination. At 40%, he might. It's right on the edge. And at 45%, he gets it. Today, he's running about 48-49% in New York, but he typically underperforms in the voting. So the fact that he's at 49%, there are some states where he hits dead on, some states where his actual vote is lower than by 2, 3, 4%. The lot changes between now and next week. It is very possible that all that coming together will mean that he will have a hard time in New York. The bigger problem is that where New York matters more is on the Democratic side. It happens that both Mr. Trump and Secretary Clinton have, I believe, about 48% in the polls right now, maybe a little lower. And Sanders has 37, and Kasich and Cruz together have 37. In other words, the parties are more or less mirror image right now. The question in both parties is New York so different from other places that they each give, than recent places where we've seen elections, primaries, that they each give that they each give large margins to these two front-runner candidates. Now, my view, I want to say this about, we hear a lot about momentum. And momentum is the idea that you won 1 and you won 2 and you won 3, so of course you'll win 4 because there's just this sweep in your direction. You've heard of this, right? My message to you is that is a mistake in analyzing American politics. American politics is an amalgam of many, many forces, demographic, economic. In this case, the perceptions of this election and the early stages of this election have been distorted, in my view, by the prominence of the American South in the first round of primaries. Remember, we had Iowa, we had New Hampshire, and then it was all the South. South Carolina, Super Tuesday, and we pretty much swept across the South. The South is, in many respects, unusual. It has a history that's apart from much of the rest of the United States. And what I'd say to you is you can't understand the South's position in American politics without being aware of that history. Until desegregation, which came late, it came in the late 60s, really, under Richard Nixon. All of the drama was during John Kennedy, but once Richard and Lyndon Johnson, the laws were passed, but Richard Nixon, through quiet diplomacy, really, fully ended segregation in the South, working with numerous local elites and local figures in the South. But until then, the South was a place apart. People left it, they didn't go in. All of the migrations of the early 20th century, which came from here, came from Poland, came from throughout Eastern Europe, came from Italy, came from Scandinavia. Those migrations never touched the South. If you have family that went to America, they did not go to the American South. They went to New York, they went to Boston, they went to Chicago. If they were Italian, they may have even gone to, they may have even gone to California. Certainly if they were Asian, they went to California. All those migrations left the South untouched. And so what you had coming out of the late 60s, and remember in American politics, that's not so long ago, what you had in the late 60s was a population in the South that was roughly in its composition identical to the population at the time of the American Revolution. In the Democratic primary, obviously, the Democratic Party in the South, in its voting, is now largely dominated by one group that came out of that time, which is African Americans. African Americans have a close relationship, or the Clintons have a close relationship with the African American community, down to probably the most important institution in the African American community for voting, and in many respects is the church, and down to the level of pastors and churches. They have deep relationships that go back decades. They themselves are from the South, they're reformists from the South on racial matters, and there are good and substantial and long-standing reasons why, if you're African American in the South, you are going to vote for the Clintons. On the Republican side, there is an American historian who's written on the influence of different groups, primarily from the British Isles, on American politics. And one of these groups is this historian, his name is David Hackett Fisher. One of these groups he calls border people. Now the borders aren't, the borders we normally think of. They are the border of Scotland and England, and the border, meaning the Irish Sea, of Ireland and migrations back and forth from the island of Britain. This group has produced many generals. Andrew Jackson, in the early part of the country's life, was a notable one and also a president. This group is one senator who's also actually a rather good scholar, named James Webb, who ran on the Democratic ticket this last time, and in this campaign dropped out early, got very little support. Wrote a book on this group called Born Fighting, and that pretty much, according to the historians, designates the attitude of this group. Combative, very much us against the world, very jealous of prerogative. Sounds like Donald Trump, doesn't it? And in fact, that's part of why that is why I say the loading up of primaries in the South was moving into a group that was very well attuned to Donald Trump. That group also, I wouldn't say has less education, but some of those economic factors tend to be loaded up in that group. And so but as we moved to other parts of the country where there were other mixes, we saw Cruz doing better, we saw Kasich doing better, we saw Sanders doing better. And so what I'm suggesting to you is that folkways, that heritage, that what you might call microcultures, though they're not so micro, have been a shaping force in this campaign. Now there's another shaping force. Since the dawn of the television age, in American politics, one of the key strategies was put advertisement on television, tell your message through the advertisement, and if you are doing face-to-face events, if I were a candidate coming here, have them made for television so they become a way of getting on the news, getting in the television, getting on the radio, and craft your remarks in ways that are designed to get quoted in those places. That age ended with this campaign. It's been going back, it's been declining for some time now. The rise of cable television meant that was a major change in that. Yes, it's still television, but it's a different kind of television. When I was in the White House, we had maybe 5 real portals through which to get our message. Everything else picked up from them. The 3 television networks and their radio affiliates, the New York Times and the Washington Post. Maybe, though it wasn't as big of much of a nearly as important a factor at that time in general elections, maybe the Wall Street Journal. With the rise of cable television, which came on really in 88, 89, and didn't mature as a force for till arguably somewhat time later, you have a speech, remarks, the like, they'll be covered wall to wall. And so you didn't, in 2008, when Clinton went against Obama, we saw you may recall, and I will tell you that there was a primary season very much like this one, and she was supposed to win easily, and then all of a sudden one was winning one week and the other was winning the next week. Some of that had to do with the demographic, maybe a lot of it, issues I've discussed already. But Barack Obama understood how to use the new medium, the cable medium, which by that point had enough audience to really matter. Every election night, primary election night, whether he won or lost, when he would come out and give a speech, as would she. And the cable networks would cover them for about 10 minutes, something that more time than the broadcast networks had been giving to candidates in decades. In 1968, the average span of time that a broadcast network would give a candidate for a statement, which is called a soundbite, was about 1.5 minutes, which is actually quite a long time. By 1988, it was 8 seconds. So Mrs. Clinton was still, and election night wasn't that the kind of thing that you might not even be covered on election night. But by 2008, the election would be the statements, at least the first 10 minutes of any statement, would be covered. What happened? Mrs. Clinton came out and did what candidates have been doing for decades. She'd thank the dog catcher, and she'd thank the state representative, and she'd thank all the people. And this can take 10 minutes. And by the time she was done and about to tell you why you should vote for her, the station would cut off and go to Mr. Obama, who would open up, would do none of that. He would open up and he'd tell you what the campaign was about. That was the first major break in the old style of advertising. Barack Obama and his people understood it light years ahead. Remember, in politics, light years are about a week. Light years ahead of all other candidates. They understood something else too, particularly in 2012. In 2012, they had 2,000 people, according to press reports, working on social media. I was writing a lot at that time for various websites about the election. And I have a Republican point of view. And I noticed that they were doing something, that I was seeing patterns of tracking comment sections in social media, tracking White House talking points. And I talked about the use of these 2,000 people, and that there was nothing coming out where there wasn't a response. And about a week later, at a different website, the one I said that I wrote this on, didn't have comments. On another website, which did have comments, and where I had a piece, the responder said something like, well, so you think that we're not following you, do you? Or something like that. In other words, was responding to my piece from the prior week in a way that was kind of snarky, but nevertheless revealing. The Barack Obama people understood cable before others understood cable, and understood social media before others understood social media. Now, for this year, that's probably changed. The Democratic Party organization, National Committee, probably is pretty good at social media, because there's still the Obama operation. But it is likely that the candidate who best understands metrics, micro-targeting, and the uses of social media by press reports is Ted Cruz. So what am I saying about, and that's one reason he may well, against what seemed to be great odds, prevail in this on the Republican side this year. So what am I saying? I'm saying, number one, this is a year where there are tremendous economic changes occurring in the United States. Number two, there are important demographic changes and patterns that can easily confuse how you see this election. And number three, this is also a year in which it is the uses of social media, the uses of new communications are transforming campaigning. One last statistic on this. Jeb Bush, by the end of February, had spent $80 million on campaign advertising. Under the old rules, that would have been definitive. He could not have been beaten. He overwhelmed everybody else. Donald Trump spent 10, most. In interviews on television, in interviews on cable television, as well as broadcast, and other forms of what is called free media, the value of Jeb Bush's presence was a few $1 million. The value of Donald Trump's presence was $1.9 billion. Campaigning is transforming in the United States. By the way, the two candidates most critical of spending in campaigns are Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, and they're the ones who are spending the least of the major candidates. This is a transforming environment. This is where the United States is right now, and that's why it's so confusing. So you don't understand it. There are a lot of reasons why no one understands it. But one last thought. Politics in a vibrant democracy should reflect changes. And when the world is changing, politics should change with it. In many ways, as disturbing as this is, I know, it's healthy. Thank you.